All right, all right. I should actually be able to be heard this time. I know I've goofed things up in the past, and people haven't heard me when I've started. Let me know in the chat if everything seems to be working fine. And great, awesome. Okay, welcome everyone. There's still going to be people showing up as we get started. So this week I am going to be talking about a short little blog post I put together. I don't remember what prompted it. I was going to say, oh, well, here's what prompted me to write this at the time. But I remember that something had sparked me to write this one because it was more of a personal blog post about my experiences doing the kind of work that I do. And let me readjust this a little. Okay, that's better. All right. Anyway, so a lot of my blog posts, I started out doing some responses to people. I write a lot about moral realism and metaethics more generally. And lately, I've talked more about metaphilosophy and about issues related to consciousness, psychophysical harmony, that sort of thing. Oh, and that reminds me, I recently appeared on the channel Digital Gnosis to speak with Nathan and Philip Goff. So if you don't know Nathan, some of you have probably come over to my channel from that channel. But also Philip Goff, who is a philosopher who is well known as a proponent of panpsychism. So we had a discussion. It was pretty broad and wide ranging and discussed issues in metaphilosophy. So anyway, I've been covering a lot of that stuff. And that was kind of a cool amalgamation of both the consciousness stuff, psychophysical harmony, which I've written, I think, 4 or 5 blog posts about now, more recent ones. And, so consciousness, psychophysical harmony, and metaphilosophical issues more broadly construed. It was an interesting discussion that we had. It was a few days ago. It was a Tuesday. So it's 4 days ago or so. I'll be uploading that to this channel as well. I don't know, in another week or 2 or something. Give it some time, get some more views over on Nathan's channel, and then we'll bring it over here and I'll direct you over there. It's a cool channel. You should check it out. There's a lot of good discussions. I did have a few other appearances there, at least 2, I think. One of them where I was talking about metaethics. I think we reviewed a video on subjectivism. I think it was a Capturing Christianity video. So that was one of them. And one second. I think the other video was more of an experimental philosophy, metaphilosophy one. I don't know what happened that day. It was very spontaneous when I went on, but it was, I thought that particular discussion went really well. And it made me think, yeah, I should span out and stop only focusing on metaethics and talk more about metaphilosophy. Anyway, so right, so I'll have that up on the channel. And also to go with this week, I had posted in the community posts, and thank you for everybody that sees those, answers those, and especially, you could just answer, but when you leave comments this week, it would be especially helpful. So this week, I don't know if everybody seeing the stream has seen those, but what I do is I typically will ask some philosophical questions. Sometimes I kind of repurpose a question from psychological research that I'm familiar with. Sometimes I pose a kind of classical philosophical question. But this week I asked for feedback on what kind of content you want to see on the channel, because I've started to spread out a bit from what I started with. I remember the first month or 2, it was just metaethics, metaethics, metaethics. And that's still going to be a mainstay of this channel. I don't want a channel to be about literally anything at all. It's going to be focused primarily on metaethics and moral psychology. But I do see my interest increasingly turning towards metaphilosophy and issues related to language and broader issues related to the methods underlying contemporary analytic philosophy more generally. That is kind of a return in a certain sense to some of my early interests when I was studying philosophy in grad school, because at the time I got really interested in experimental philosophy and, what are these intuitions? What are they supposed to be? And despite studying the matter a bit, I never came to any decisive conclusions, and I still haven't. The methods that analytic philosophers use still seem kind of obscure to me, and they still seem very non-obvious. I think if you look at what few works there are on the methods used by philosophers, they often come off as rather contentious or vague or underdeveloped. And, it's not really clear what exactly philosophers take themselves to be doing. I don't know what the provenance of these intuitions are. In fact, it's so unclear, and this is something I'll be addressing in one of my future streams, that some people like Capella and have wrote this book called Philosophy Without Intuitions, which argues that a lot of what are taken to be classical philosophical arguments that have been framed or purport to be soliciting philosophical intuitions or employing philosophical intuitions as evidence for philosophical theories don't in fact do so. Now, this has been met with a lot of disdain and dismissiveness and scorn and criticism. And I'm not saying that I endorse the view, but it's interesting that it's like not obvious how philosophy is supposed to work, analytic philosophy. Some philosophers may balk at that and say, no, it's quite clear. But then if you ask them, they're all going to disagree with each other. And they might say, okay, but that's the nature of philosophy. We're going to disagree about everything. But there seems to me to be a lack of the kind of precision, clarity, and rigor that analytic philosophy takes itself to, that it is supposed to be central to the discipline, like what it prides itself on being all about. And, for instance, one example of this is just the total lack of consistency in terminology in contemporary metaethics. Is the term objectivism, absolutism, stance independence, mind independence. These terms seem to shift and change. Stance independence seems to be gaining popularity, but people used to say mind independence. People get mixed up about the terminology. People dispute. So you'll have people that say objectivism is technically distinct from stance independence. Other people use the terms interchangeably. So there's all this terminological inconsistency, and I find that really disappointing. Anyway, so what I wanted to do today was go through that post, which I had written all the way back in, I think, December. It was quite a while ago, or not December, September. And it's a pretty short one. So I'll read through that. And then I guess I'll just talk about whatever. I'll see who's in the chat, what kind of questions, comments, that sort of thing that you have. I'll look at the results of the poll, that sort of thing. And then we'll go from there. Okay, so let me dig up the post. Here it is. All right. So this post is called The Positive in the Negative. And I will try to read through it in one go. Hopefully won't stumble over it too much, and there'll probably be a typo or two. We will see. Okay, here we go. My work has always focused on criticism. In philosophy, I tend not to present new positions or defend novel claims, but to critique other people's claims and point out what I take to be shortcomings in the position that others take, or in many cases, in the methods they use to arrive at their conclusions. When I moved over to psychology, I quickly fell into the same routine. I started out running studies, but quickly became more interested in the methods used to conduct studies. It wasn't long before almost all of my work focused on criticizing the methods of contemporary social psychology and experimental philosophy. Some people aren't too fond of this kind of work. The common refrain is that it is purely destructive. It's not constructive. Useful work, so this thinking goes, adds to our knowledge. It doesn't tear our knowledge down. This is complete nonsense. It's just as important to eliminate false beliefs as it is to add true beliefs. In many cases, it is far more important, since the cumulative nature of knowledge builds on the past. If we build poor foundations on false beliefs and bad methods, this can have significant downstream consequences. In some cases, it can lead to years or even decades of wasted time, effort, and resources on what turns out to be a whole lot of nothing. I suspect one reason people dislike an overly critical approach is that it seems somehow impolite. But it may also seem derivative, passive, and reactive. While others are out trying to proactively build something new, I merely follow behind, hoping to pick through the scraps. The constructive researcher is seen as noble and bold and adventurous, plunging into the darkness to retrieve the chalice from the dragon. Meanwhile, us destructive researchers are envious scavengers following in their shadows. Back at the tavern, the bards sing of the constructive researchers' exploits, weaving tales of mighty dragons and cunning sorcerers, while destructive researchers sip their ale at the back of the tavern, bitterly pointing out that the dragon wasn't that mighty and the sorcerer wasn't that cunning. This is likely a common sentiment. First, suppose there were truth in this depiction. Suppose, that is, that the destructive researchers really are passively waiting to snipe at the constructive researchers' heroics. Well, so what? We may not like the destructive researcher, but we still have to ask, was the dragon really that mighty? Was the sorcerer that cunning? We may even wonder whether there were any dragons or sorcerers at all. Perhaps the hero just scrounged up an old cup in the attic. Doesn't it matter if the hero's tale is actually true? My criticisms focus on both philosophy and psychology. My concerns began with problems in philosophy, and then they became problems in psychology. But now I'm realizing that the problem goes much deeper. They cut to the heart of academia. Academia has set up a system of incentives and norms that have made the entire structure one of battling to climb to a hill and then defend your place on it. As all the low-hanging fruit was swept away by early advances, researchers have had to carve out ever tiny areas of specialization, leaving them with no place to go. Where once there was a sprawling new land with room for everyone, now people are crammed into the academic equivalent of a tiny studio apartment with the walls shrinking every day. People's careers, identity, finances, and sense of self-worth becomes defined by their little slice of territory. Everything hinges on it. So of course, they're going to be defensive and protective. It's all that they have. But really, it's all that they think they have. There's something liberating and exciting in recognizing that you don't actually have to play this game. You don't have to defend that tiny slice of territory. There's still a lot of room for discovery and insight. With past psychological findings crumbling away and leaving a field in the state of doubt, there's a lot of room for growth in the field. Analytic philosophy is much the same. It's predicated on dubious methods and mistaken views about how language works. There's plenty of room for insight there, too, if people will just take lessons from Wittgenstein and others seriously and recognize that we have a lot of metaphilosophical room to step out of the confines of the narrow method to discover and deploy whole new methods. It's remarkable that my criticisms are seen so pessimistic and unwelcome. The way I see my critiques, they're cracks in the walls of the institutional prisons that academics have entombed themselves in. All right, so that's what I'd written at the time. I think I still endorse all of that. And, what I'm getting at here is this view, and this is something that you'll sometimes hear from people, is they'll say, well, it's all well and good for you to present all of these criticisms, but what's your view on the matter? What's your view on the matter? I'm supposed to have like a substantive metaphilosophical, I should say a substantive account of metaphysics. I should have a substantive epistemology. How do we acquire concepts? How do we know what's really real? And often my answer in a lot of these cases is, I'm not really sure. But I do know that your method is really questionable and probably not the way that things are. The thing is, though, when you raise those sorts of concerns, a lot of times people want to go, well, what's your solution then? And the implication often seems to be, if you can't provide a satisfactory account or even like an okay account, like it's just, I'm going to put you on the spot, give an account, and it better be at least marginally acceptable, or else what? If someone presents a ridiculous, so let's go back to 1800. We didn't have the origin of species. We didn't have the theory of evolution by natural selection. We didn't have any of that. And there's all these different accounts of how organismic diversity arose on the earth. And if someone said, I think, and then they proceeded to say something completely insane, made no sense, and you criticize that, if it was just absurd, and you raised a bunch of objections to that, it would be weird for them to go, well, what's your theory? As if you have to have a developed theory that's really compelling, or else what? Then their theory is a good one. The fact that your theory is terrible or not very explanatorily robust or is riddled with problems, that isn't somehow mitigated by or eliminated by the fact that the person pointing that out doesn't have an account of their own. So this is something I've always disliked about the kind of animus or dismissiveness or indifference people have to critical approaches. And, there's cases where it's really strange. So, Wittgenstein is hailed as one of the most prominent and influential philosophers of the 20th century and is seen as this really important figure. Maybe part of that is due to the earlier work, but the later Wittgenstein, a lot of it, it's scorn, dismissiveness. But what's strange about that is that even when there's a lot of respect or recognition of influence, those lessons don't seem to have deeply internalized themselves in the way analytic philosophy functions. It's like, ordinary language philosophy came and went. These critical approaches that point out all the weird sort of philosophical shift between everyday meaning and the way that philosophers handle terms and concepts, how there's this sort of consistent shift, almost like an equivocation, where they're appropriating these terms from everyday discourse and employing them in philosophical contexts in ways that don't reflect their ordinary usage, but then they treat them as if they are. There's just a lot of strange stuff going on. There's a lot of, I think, insight, and basically it's just correct, and in a lot of these criticisms, and yet it's not like that reverberated across analytic philosophy and changed the field. It's like the people that took those criticisms seriously carved out their distinctive intellectual spaces and then went off and did their own thing, and the rest of philosophy remained largely unchanged. It's like there's this sort of this just massive hulking behemoth of orthodox ways of thinking that just seems impervious to any type of metaphilosophical criticism. Meanwhile, the metaphilosophical, like the framework, the way it's supposed to function, remains obscure, and it's not clear that it works. I mean, this is a common thing that I encounter when I talk to people is, ever since the Phil Paper's results started getting published, there was one back in 2009 and then more recently one in 2020. People will appeal to those and will say, well, most philosophers think this, most philosophers think that, as though that's supposed to be a really compelling reason to endorse the view. And people will say, well, look, if most physicists think this, or if most geologists think that, or if most whatever think this about a particular issue, it's a little weird for both a non-expert or even an expert within the field to reject the consensus within the field, or even just a majority. It doesn't have to be some sort of broad consensus. And there's some merit to that, depending on what the field is. But, there are fields like astrology where I would not think. So if you went and ask most astrologers, people that purport to be experts at astrology, is astrology real? Does it work? Most of them are going to say yes. Does that mean we have to take astrology seriously because most of the people doing it think that it works? I don't think so. And so I think there's a lack of appreciation that simply because a community of thinkers in a particular discipline purport to be experts, it doesn't mean that they're experts in everything or in the relevant sorts of things. So, I grant that it's almost certainly the case that philosophers relative to non-philosophers are quite a bit better at formal logic. They're very likely, almost certainly, in fact, better at understanding the history of philosophy itself. They could tell you a lot more about Locke or Socrates or Aristotle or Plato or whatever. They're going to have certain sorts of, they're going to have various types of expertise in terms of their knowledge, in terms of certain sorts of skills and abilities. They might be better on average at taking a text that's written in plain language and interpreting arguments that appear in there. They might be better at spotting fallacies. They might be better at a whole lot of things. But are they better at having correct intuitions? I don't know. And there's another concern, which is, how would we know? Would we appeal to those methods themselves? Does philosophy justify itself? Or are there some sort of external markers we might appeal to assess whether philosophy really endows those who practice it with certain types of expertise of the relevant kind? If most philosophers agree that Socrates was an historical figure, that Plato thinks this and Aristotle thinks that, there's all sorts of things. If most philosophers look at this really complicated argument, you give them all a week to analyze it, and 96% of them say, yeah, this is a valid argument. Sure, okay, I'll take that as pretty good evidence that it's a valid argument. But when most philosophers endorse, most of them say that they're moral realists, or most of them endorse a particular, like, we can have a priori knowledge, or P zombies are conceivable, or whatever. How strong of evidence is that those positions are true? I don't know. And I don't know how to assess that. And I think that people that appeal to consensus or majority view among philosophers are being a bit preemptive in granting that the convergence that we see within philosophy, or at least I should say analytic philosophy, is some sort of strong indication of what's actually true about the issue in question. And I don't think that it is. Okay, let me check out the chat, say hi to people, and do all of that. If you didn't answer the poll, I'm going to end the poll. It looks like we got an even split. Oh, so I should say, so I asked the poll, does philosophy make progress? And it looks like we got an even split between, yes, it's made a lot of progress. Yes, it's made some progress. No, there's been no real progress. And I don't know, show results. So let's end the poll. Oh, we only got 12 votes, but that's okay. But it is interesting. It had exactly an even split after I was just talking about convergence. Okay, let's see what we got as far as the chat goes. Okay, I see great arrival on moral realism. I'm not sure what you're referring to. Oh, you're talking about the Philip Goff discussion? Yeah, so go check that out. But again, I'll be posting here, but you could go check it out on Digital Gnosis, and you should. So go check it out there. I thought it was a really cool discussion. So to say a bit more about the discussion, so I think Nathan generally is pretty sympathetic to or similar to my perspective on the matter, but we had discussed psychophysical harmony, and we kind of framed the discussion that we had with Goff around the notion of psychophysical harmony, but rather than assess the sort of the bolts and screws of that particular argument, we got more metaphilosophical and we addressed more background issues. So psychophysical harmony, there's a new paper coming out by Cutter and Crummett that present this argument from psychophysical harmony, and it's a new argument for the existence of God. So it's an argument for theism, and it's a bit like it's a sort of a reformulation or a new. It's similar. It's kind of in the same category as fine-tuning arguments. And basically, what the psychophysical harmony argument begins with is saying, look, there are these phenomenal states. There's experiential states that have these certain sorts of properties, these phenomenal states, and we need to account for those. But there's also physical states. There's matter. People have brains and they engage in behavior and they do stuff. And so we have these physical states, we have these phenomenal states, and there is a sort of extraordinary alignment or correlation between the specific phenomenal states that we have and the physical states that seem to be associated with them, that seem to correlate with them. So for instance, if you touch a hot stove and you feel pain, the phenomenal states or the qualia associated with the experience of that pain response, you pull your hand away and you go, ow, 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 and you hurt your hand. You engage in the functional behavioral outputs of someone that has experienced pain. And there's this physical stuff associated with tissue damage and that sort of thing, and the nerve impulses that cause you to pull your hand away. So you got all the physical stuff there, but you also have this qualitative experience of pain. You have pain qualia. And it looks like, pain qualia correlate with painful behaviors and the physical states that induce them. And happiness qualia are associated with enjoyable experiences and the physical states that produce those. And if we grant that there's this correlation seems extraordinary. It's quite surprising. So then the question is, how would you explain this surprising correlation? And what the authors of the paper ultimately argue is that theism provides a good explanation for this. And certain other philosophical positions, particularly types of physicalism that aren't able to reconcile this correlation, this would be type B physicalism, those positions really struggle to accommodate this correlation. Now, what I ended up pointing out, and I think other people have as well, is that there is another way you could go, which is to deny that there are phenomenal states, and thus deny that there is there isn't a correlation between A and B, because there just isn't A. Now, you could actually build on that and also raise questions about whether there are physical states. And, you could deny that there are phenomenal or physical states, and then that solves the problem. You could deny one or both. But I go further in denying the intelligibility of phenomenal states. So I endorse a view called qualia quietism. And this view roughly is the view that terms like phenomenal state, qualia, what it's like, and I mean what it's like in the context in which it's used to explain what qualia phenomenal states are, this sort of terminology is vacuous. It doesn't mean anything. And there's a few reasons why I think it doesn't mean anything. One of them is a kind of dialectical one where it's more of an abductive inference that I make, which is, what do I think the best explanation for this dialectical pattern in the way the conversations tend to go is? So the way that works is, and this is something that Pete Mandic talks about in a paper on qualia quietism. It's a paper that I should post the paper, but it's on qualia quietism and meta-illusionism. And I mentioned it probably several times. Let me put it in the chat. Actually, let me find the paper. I'll just find the actual paper itself. Give me 1 second. I would say I'll find it later, but I'll totally forget and not do it. So, okay, I put the reference in there. You should be able to find it on Phil Papers. And you should know about Phil Papers. If you don't, it's an excellent resource and repository for a lot of people's papers. So go check that out. Get rid of this for now. So anyway, so I endorse this view called qualia Aquatism. And as I was saying, you kind of get into this loop when you ask people, well, what are these phenomenal states? What are qualia? Now, first, before you even get to the loop, there's actually another issue. I'm doing this thing where I get into this and I start one topic and then I open another topic. It's like my computer. You should see how many tabs I have open. Like what? Let's see. I'm actually going to count my tabs. I have 18 tabs open right now. That's not that bad. Oh wait, no, never mind. 1 second. I probably have more open. Oh no, just 18. Yeah, I have 18 tabs open. That's on the low end for me. It's often like 30 or so. So my attention goes all over the place. Anyway, so one of the most frustrating things about people talking about phenomenal states or qualia is that they will do this kind of strategic equivocation when you bring up the topic of qualia or phenomenal states. So if you're not already familiar with qualia or phenomenal states, they're supposed to refer to these certain the sort of qualitative nature of subjective experience. Specifically, that there are certain sorts of properties that our subjective experience has, and the qualia are those properties. They're like these certain features of our experience. They're a certain kind of phenomena that isn't reducible to like functional states, reportable states. It's not like they're not relational. So if I see red, so there are facts about seeing red. There's my knowledge of like what sorts of things are red and what sorts of things tend not to be red. There's my knowledge of my past experiences of red. I might think, red's not my favorite color. Ooh, red would be good for this. Red would be good for that. Strawberries are red. There's my attitude. Red. There's the connotations or the emotions evoked by the color. So red seems more of like an angry color, a passionate color, that sort of thing. It's not about all of that. It's that when you clear all of that other stuff away, all the properties associated with or prompted by viewing red, you see there's just the redness of red. That's what qualia or phenomenal states are supposed to be. There's a redness to red. There's a painfulness to pain. There's a yellowness to yellow. It's the yellowness of the yellow. It's the chocolatiness of chocolate, and so on. So that's what qualia is supposed to be. Now that's a very crude way of describing it. But the thing is, when you scratch the surface, people can't really tell you much more than that. But anyway, regarding this sort of strategic equivocation, you'll kind of get tiered layers of how much people will pack into their description of what qualia or phenomenal states are. Often, if you reject the idea that there are phenomenal states or qualia, I'll just go with phenomenal state for now, or whatever. Maybe I'll be interchangeable. I don't care, whatever. People say, what, you're denying their subjective experience? You're denying people have experiences? That's absurd. Of course people have experiences. That's a ridiculous position. But then if qualia or phenomenal states is just a stand-in for experience or subjective experience in what? Some unspecified theory neutral sense, then that's not a very, like, why do we need this terminology? So often people will use this kind of minimal definition, which is philosophically underspecified. It's kind of theory neutral. And the idea is, look, there's at least something that we're all referring to when we talk about subjective experience or just experience or phenomenology or whatever. That, whatever that is, we all agree, never mind the skeptic or whatever, this exists. Of course, there are skeptics that might deny even that. We agree that this exists, and I would agree that that exists. I'm experiencing something, but often what happens is people will start to smuggle in other characteristics and features until you get a much more metaphysically robust account of what qualia is supposed to be. And what this ends up looking like is people will start saying, well, that they're private. So whatever these phenomenal states are, they're private. They're not just inaccessible in practice, they're inaccessible in principle to any sort of third personal account. You can't crack open someone's skull, look inside and see the phenomenal states, nor could you ever discover what they are with any type of scientific instrument. They're just, the qualitative nature of our experiences is, ex hypothesi like entirely outside the bounds of scientific or empirical analysis at all. It's just something that's fundamentally inaccessible from a third person point of view. That's just the nature of it. So that's one property. Another property is, as I said before, they're sort of intrinsic or non-relational properties. They can't really be cashed out in terms of their associations or relatedness to other sorts of things. You might say that they're sui generis. They are themselves in and of themselves. They're not anything else. They're not, they just are what they are. There's only so many ways I could try to cash out that idea. They are ineffable, or you could say incommunicable. So, and this is, of course, these are very closely associated. They're private, but the contents of them cannot be articulated in any language. You cannot communicate what the qualitative nature of the redness of red is. It's not like describing the physical appearance of a banana. I could tell you what a banana looks like, or it's not like describing the behavior of a chicken. It's not like describing the properties of gold atoms or water. You can tell someone all about those sorts of things, and those descriptions figure into our accounts in biology and chemistry and physics and so on, where you could read in a textbook what it's like, what those characteristics are, what those properties are, what those phenomena are. But qualia are not like that. Again, when people start bringing in these more robust features, these characteristics are fundamentally incommunicable. Like in principle, you could not, it's not like we just lack the capacity to articulate the content, like what the redness of red is. It's just not the sort of thing that you could relate what it is, using language. And then finally, they are directly or immediately apprehensible to consciousness. So like you just immediately have, so if you see red, you have red qualia, boom, immediate. It's just, you have direct access to it. Now, those are the four properties that Dan Dennett attributes to qualia in the paper Quining Qualia. And I do recommend checking that paper out. It's an interesting paper. He does he has an interesting style and approach to writing papers where he moves you through a series of intuition pumps that are supposed to serve as a kind of, I want to say like a grok ramp. So like as you move up the ramp, moving through the different sorts of intuition pumps, you come to sort of internalize the gestalt or really come to understand the idea at a more intuitive level, rather than just having this kind of external, dead, like intellectual understanding. Like if someone says the universe is 14 billion years old or close to it, you could read that on paper, but that's very different from feeling it, So that paper introduces those four characteristics, and that's what I take qualia to actually be constituted by, at least a meaningful and interesting account of qualia. So the problem is that I don't think that there is anything like that, nor do I think that there could be anything like that. The whole idea strikes me as utterly vacuous. There's supposed to be these properties, or this phenomena. There's supposed to be something that there's supposed to be a redness to red, but it's incommunicable. It's non-relational. These things, these supposed characteristics of our experiences, as far as I could tell, they don't do anything. They don't serve any explanatory role. They don't have, I don't think, any content. And I think that people fall into the mistake of thinking that they have content, of thinking that they're meaningful, because we've created a kind of web of verbal associations. And like we use all these words that seem to be referring to things that exist. And we're so embedded in a language in which we do this. We talk about cups and walls and headphones. The words I'm using, headphones, this points to something that's real. Glasses, faces. That when people use all the sophisticated language to refer to these other sorts of things, we can feel or have the impression that we're really referring to things. That these things are real. We're using language to refer to it. And there's just something very strange about this presumption that people have, this confidence people have, that when they use words and there's like linguistic communities that all share certain linguistic practices, that there's something to it. And I think sometimes there just isn't. So to move on to this sort of the dialectical loop that you go into, I've called this a kind of terminological Mobius strip before. So the idea here is, if you ask someone, what is a phenomenal state? You'll often get a response like, well, it's what it's like to have an experience. Now, that might sound like an answer. And there's a few things that I think are wrong with this sort of approach. Now, for me, when I hear that, I don't know what that means either. So I see red. I supposedly have access to red qualia or red phenomenal states. There's phenomenal red, right? And then I say, well, what does that mean? What's the phenomenal red aspect of my experience of red? What's the red qualia? Well, it's what it's like to see red. Now, what the hell does that mean? There's all sorts of ways I could use the term what it's like. I could tell you what it's like to, burn my hand as opposed to put my hand in cold water. I could tell you that one is cooler, one is hotter, one is more painful, the other is less painful. And then if you said, well, what do you mean by pain? I could say it induces a kind of aversive reaction in me that makes me feel compelled to pull my hand away. The other one doesn't. Like, I could just tell you all sorts of relational facts and things that would be cashed out in terms of what's happening to my body, what's happening to me emotionally, what's happening to me behaviorally. There's all sorts of things I could say about the differences between those states. And a lot of that is captured by a lot of conventional uses of what it's like. So, if someone travels to Paris and then they come back and you've never been there, you might ask them, what was it like? And then they could tell you, oh, it was like this, it was like that. They could tell you all sorts of descriptive facts about what Paris was like. And there's nothing unusual about their use of the phrase, what it's like, or you asking, what was it like? And then saying, oh, here's what it was like. So that terminology already has a familiar embedded use in the way that we all think. By embedded, I just mean it's not like someone uses the phrase and you hadn't heard it before, but the words make sense, so you understand them. I mean, this is already built in to our everyday discourse, this use of terminology, what it's like. But when philosophers use this terminology in the context of qualia, they end up using the terminology in a different way. And this is what I mean when I say that philosophers will sort of co-opt or extract language that has everyday usages, redeploy it in a philosophical context, and then rely on their audiences or their interlocutors to get the resonance, the feeling that, of course, what it's like means something. I've used the term, you use the term, I've heard it my whole life. Of course, it means something, so it must mean something here. But the problem is that turns of phrase like what it's like, as they're used in everyday discourse, have a meaning that it only it obtains in virtue of their use within those everyday contexts. What I mean by that is that words and terms and turns of phrases don't have any sort of intrinsic meaning. The phrase, what it's like, does not in and of itself mean anything. It only has meaning in virtue of its usage in a particular linguistic community or in a particular linguistic context. And if we wanted to know what people actually are intending to mean when they use phrases like what it's like in everyday contexts, that's an empirical question. And it's not at all obvious that any of the ordinary usages, or at least any significant number, some non-negligible amount, are being used to describe intrinsic, intrinsic, non-relational, ineffable, private, immediately apprehensible experiential states that are like purely qualitative and I think I already said non-relational. So are they using terminology to refer to that sort of stuff? I don't think so. And if someone thinks that they are, I think the onus is on them to demonstrate that they are. And I think philosophers don't do the empirical work to show that people are using language that way. So we have this phrase, what it's like. And it has these everyday sorts of usages. Now, I suspect in these everyday sorts of usages that its meaning is largely relational. And it's if someone says what it's like, it's used as a sort of way to leverage or refer to certain sorts of communicable characteristics. What is Paris like? Oh, well, it's like this. So if someone said, like, what is it like when it's raining? Oh, it tends to be cooler. It tends to be water falling out of the sky. It splashes on the ground. There's often a distinct smell if you're around, grass or soil. You could describe all of these things associated with rain. And the thing is, I think in those usages, when someone says what it's like to stand in the rain or for it to be raining, that what it's like is exhausted by those sorts of descriptions. There's not an intrinsic what it's like for it to be raining. What it's like to be raining simply refers to those describable, those communicable characteristics. There isn't anything private to it. Now, I don't think that people have some sort of metaphysical commitment to the meaning of what it's like being exhausted by the communicable characteristics of what it's like for it to be raining. I just think that the language is used to facilitate the ability to bring up, mention, reference, and describe and talk about those sorts of things, these describable characteristics. I don't think there's all this metaphysics built into everyday speech. And so I think it's virtually irrelevant for philosophers to try, when they're talking about what it's like in a philosophical context, to sort of parasitize what they mean off of what they take ordinary language to mean. I mean, one, they don't actually know what ordinary people mean because they don't do the empirical work to find out. Two, ordinary people probably mean a whole bunch of different things. And which one of those meanings do they use? A lot of times philosophers seem to think that there's this like a single common sense or like a shared usage to certain sorts of terms or words or turns of phrase or whatever. Why think that? I don't think language works that way. I think language is very context driven, and that words have a variety. It's like, word meaning is like any particular word in different across different usages for the same speaker, and in standard usage for different speakers are like a bunch of Venn diagrams that are like kind of overlapping but not perfectly overlapping. The extensions, the contents, the connotations, the associations, they all subtly vary in after every usage. So just like, I forget which pre-Socratic philosopher said you can't step into the same river twice. There's a certain sense in which if we're thinking of words as having some sort of perfect essence where they have a rigid and fixed meaning, they don't. And in a certain sense, you could say no one ever really uses a word to mean exactly the same thing twice. Now, that might make language seem like weirdly unstable, but it's not. It's more that it's like archways or pillars or other sorts of structural features that hold up buildings. Now, there's something shared across all of these instances of an arch, which is that they have a similar sort of structure, but every arch is unique in its own sort of way. And you could think of each use of a word or turn of phrase very much like you could think of independent archways or structures, where each one of them is both unique from the others in certain respects and highly similar in other respects. And just because there's, thousands and millions of arches in the world supporting and holding up different structures, it doesn't mean they're all literally identical to one another. They're all subtly different in different sorts of ways. And you could see each use of a word as being just like that. I mean, exactly the same word. Even words like bird. It's not like the exact extension of what, each person's like prototypes and exemplars, and the way that they conceptualize birds is literally identical to somebody else's. Two people can meaningfully, a person gets a new puppy and it's a German Shepherd and they're talking with their friend about this, look at this dog. Oh yes, yeah, what a lovely dog. They could use that word dog, even though if you ask them, is like a coyote a dog, one of them might say no and one might say yes. Or is like a half wolf, half dog hybrid, is that a dog? They might disagree. And so, the way that people categorize different sorts of things can subtly differ, and it doesn't mean they can't meaningfully communicate with one another. So there's a great deal of stability and shared overlap in linguistic usage, but it doesn't mean that words have essences or intrinsic meaning. Words have no meaning. Words are a behavior that people employ to communicate their intentions. That's it. That's all that they are. They're mouth sounds that are used they're a special type of behavior that humans developed. So anyway, to go back to this sort of discussion about qualia, what ends up happening is that you ask someone what they mean by qualia or phenomenal state, and you get into this loop. Well, it's what it's like. It's what, and then if you say, okay, well, what does that mean? So no. So my point in bringing all that up is that that might look like it means something, but I don't think that it does. I don't think what it's like in the context of being used to facilitate an account of what qualia or phenomenal states are is actually meaningful in that context. Because remember, what I'm arguing is that words derive their meaning from context. What does it mean in this context? I don't know. And so if you then ask, well, what do you mean by that? That is already putting some pressure on you. And I think that there's something wrong with what's going on here dialectically. Someone asks you, what do you mean by that? Now, if you give any answer at all that superficially looks like an answer to the question, does that mean you're off the hook? You have no responsibility to give any further explanation. If they go, well, hold up, what do you mean by that? That you could go, no, I already answered your question. We're done here. because that's how it seems to function in practice. So here's how a conversation might go. So a person goes, yeah, Lance is ridiculous. Or maybe they're talking to me. Lance, that's ridiculous. Of course there's qualia. I mean, if there's one thing we could be sure about, it's that we have qualia. I don't know. I don't even know if I don't have to know if there's an external world. I don't have to know if anything in our scientific theories is true. None of that. One thing I do know is that when I see red, there's a redness to that red. Okay, so if I respond by going, what do you mean by that? What's this redness? And they're like, qualia, phenomenal states. Most philosophers would agree that this is one of the most obvious things that there are. Of course, there's qualia. It's one of the most. It's one of the things that we could be most confident that there is. It might even be a thing that we can't reasonably believe, like you couldn't really disbelieve it. And they might not even. They might even say to me, Lance, you can't really not believe in this stuff. And I have had people say that. So I say that, and then I go, well, what is this stuff? What's qualia? And they might say, well, it's what it's like to see red, or what it's like to feel pain, or what it's like to see a sunset, or whatever. And then if I say, well, what do you mean by what it's like? What does that mean? Oh, come on. You know what I mean. No, I don't know what you mean. Now, there's a bunch of moves that can end up happening. One is there's already sometimes a kind of posturing, like, I've already answered your question. Don't be pedantic or rude or irritating or annoying or nitpicky by continuing to bother me with these questions. So that's one thing. Another is people telling you, you know what I mean. No, I don't. And it's pretty frustrating to have other people try to tell you what your beliefs are, what you think. And it's one of those things that really bothers me. I don't presume to know what other philosophers think on their behalf. And if I'm sure I've done it. And if I do, and someone goes, no, hold up, that's not what I think. Please don't tell me what I think. My inclination is to go, whoops, okay, fair enough. But I don't think that, for a lot of the positions I endorse, qualia quietism, or more generally like illusionist type accounts that deny phenomenal consciousness, moral anti-realism, that sort of thing, I'm often told I don't really believe it, or I couldn't really believe it, or that sort of thing. And it's such a weak type of objection. It's psychologizing the person, I think, because the person doesn't have any good objections. So I think it's really unfortunate when people do that. And I think people shouldn't do that. And I think a lot of this comes from philosophers, especially in, I don't know much about philosophical traditions outside of analytic philosophy. There seems to be this longstanding presumption that there is some sort of shared common sense view. There's, philosophers will even go so far as to say, this view is intuitive. Notice what they say. So someone will say moral realism is intuitive, and it's anti-realism is counterintuitive. What the hell? What does that mean? It's like saying chocolate is tasty. To who? Because if by chocolate is tasty, you meant something like most people find chocolate tasty, fine. But isn't philosophy supposed to be the field all about clarity, precision, and rigor, especially analytic philosophy? So if you mean most people, like more than 50%, like chocolate, why not say that? In fact, why not say more than 50% of people like chocolate if that's what you mean? Why say chocolate is tasty? It's ambiguous, it's not clear, it's not precise. So when someone says moral realism is intuitive, what the hell does that mean? It could mean I find it intuitive. It could mean most people find it intuitive. It could mean all people find it intuitive. It could be that there are certain sorts of facts about which sorts of things are or are not intuitive, independent of the proportion of people that find them intuitive. Because, I don't think someone that says moral realism is intuitive would say, okay, well, it's not intuitive anymore. If you released some chemical into the air that made everybody think moral realism is false and counterintuitive, I think they would say, yeah, well, you change that, people aren't reasoning properly anymore. So maybe there's some normative components to it being intuitive. I don't know, because people just say it's intuitive and they don't tell you what the hell they mean by that. But they'll sometimes use quantified language that they'll say, we find it intuitive. Us, we. Who the hell is we? And when you ask, I often get pushback. And what do you mean we? I mean everybody. You do too. And I've been told what my intuitions are many times. So I think there's this, and this we have to object to this. Someone has got to really convince analytic philosophers this is not a reasonable way to talk about people. It's not reasonable to treat how things seem to you to be how they seem to everyone. If we went back to the Middle Ages, people might say, well, it seems like God exists, or it's intuitive that God exists. Well, most philosophers now are atheists. It's like, what, 80-something%, at least in the Phil Papers respondents, most of them are atheists. So do they think it seems like God exists, but God doesn't? I doubt it. I bet a majority of them would say, no, it doesn't seem to me that God doesn't seem one way or the other. I don't know. So this idea that things seem a certain sort of way, and this is like some sort of immutable property of the propositions themselves and not some contingent variable fact about human psychology, it's just there's not a it's just ridiculous. And yet philosophers continue to this day. You will see papers come out this year where they continue to publish articles saying, we think this is intuitive, this is commonsensical, with no evidence that most people think this, no clarification, no specificity. They just cite it. These underspecified, vague, and ambiguous this language, and that has been used over and over and over to as a sort of a rhetorical bludgeon against anybody that for whom it doesn't seem that way, where there's something wrong with us for it not seeming that way. And I think that this has created some really negative consequences for analytic philosophy. A lot of people in my position that hold unconventional views, look how I started today on this stream by talking about how I've embraced the fact that a critical perspective, an almost exclusively critical perspective, is important and valuable. Look what I'm doing. In a certain sense, I'm trying to convince myself by writing that down. It's not like if I was so convinced of it that it was a given that I wouldn't even bother to say anything. I'm writing that in part to as a sort of like a self-therapy to try to say, look, I think what I'm doing is valuable, and I'm going to say that. Now, a lot of people that do this, the kind of work I do, or would have the inclination to do so, they get into philosophy, and people are talking about qualia and realism and all this stuff. And if they were like me and had an inclination to think this is a bunch of bullshit, what are they going to do if people go, no, it's not. This is for real. I have the intuition. You don't have the intuition. And if you don't, what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to just continue in the field in spite of the fact that you just don't have all these intuitions other people have? I don't know. It can be pretty discouraging. And I suspect that when certain sorts of views, the views about which view is intuitive or not even just which view is true or not, because you're totally allowed without much disdain. I mean, some, but not that as much as me. To like, if you're within analytic philosophy, and let's say you're in metaethics, and you're an anti-realist, you're like, look, I'm an error theorist. I think moral realism is intuitive, but I think it's wrong in spite of the fact that it's very intuitive. That's okay. That's fine. You're wrong as an error theorist, and you're probably a terrible person. By the way, I'm just saying this is a common perspective I see. This is not my view, in case you're joining the stream now and going, wait, is Lance saying error theorists are evil? No, I am not. So the idea is just that error theorists that grant the sort of a dialectical framing of the realism, anti-realism dispute, and they say, okay, I grant that realism is intuitive, but I disagree with it anyway, that position is more acceptable as a position within analytic philosophy. But if someone comes along and says, I don't think it's intuitive, or I don't think intuitions are especially diagnostic here, that sort of thing, that view is treated with a greater degree of indifference or dismissiveness. It's not always derision and scorn. It's not like everybody, hates quietists. Maybe a lot of people do, but not everybody has such a strong attitude. They might just think, look, if we know that these are the intuitions people have, we know this is the common sense view, and when you say, I don't have the intuition that realism is true, you just sound like a goofy person. It's like a person saying, I don't have the intuition the external world exists. I don't have the intuition that I have hands. You just sound like a person that for whatever reason, you fell into some sort of, or maybe you're naturally disposed away, I don't know. You're just super skeptical. And that's fine. Go be skeptical somewhere else, because it's not our job to convince you of the really obvious stuff. We're taking some sort of starting point. The external world exists, and we're trying to extrapolate and see the implications of that. So the world exists. Now, what is its nature? That's a question I want to answer. I don't want to deal with these annoying skeptics that are just saying, does it exist? I don't know. And so the people within the philosophical community might view someone with my point of view that way. So it's not that they are like, this perspective is so threatening and terrible. No, it's just, well, I don't have time. This is not even worth engaging with. And I think that's the attitude a lot of people have. And I think it's pretty unfortunate, because if you're entering a field and there's this attitude, not of outright hostility, but kind of just indifference, it's just like, whatever, I don't care. That is not a very encouraging attitude to encounter. And unfortunately, that I think and this look, it's not just like my particular perspective on like two issues, because I talk about meta ethics and consciousness a bit, and not a whole lot else. I don't talk about most stuff in epistemology. I don't talk about most stuff in metaphysics. I don't talk about most stuff in normative ethics or applied ethics. There's so many branches of philosophy that I don't really address much or at all. But in all of those areas, they might have their own sort of like orthodox or standard or conventional views, or views about what the common sense positions. Some fields may be less disposed to as like normative or meta ethics to regard common sense as especially important. Maybe with some areas in philosophy of science. I don't know. I don't know that much about these other areas. But the point is that certain sorts of views might become entrenched in a way that discourages people with contrary perspectives, especially metaphilosophically contrary perspectives, from entering and engaging. And I think that creates a kind of unhelpful insularity to analytic philosophy, where it's driving away precisely the kinds of criticisms that it would need to really refine itself at the more foundational level. So if it's built on questionable foundations, and all the arguments are happening at the sort of at the philosophical extremities, then we're not really getting at, the branches. We're not really getting at whether there are potential concerns with the roots. So if you're convinced your roots are solid, and someone comes and says, maybe there's a problem with the roots, and you go, no, leave us alone. Those are in place. What if you got a problem there? I don't see the kind of reflection and self-criticism and concern about the lack of precision and clarity and specificity of the methods of philosophy as I think that there ought to be. There's a sort of a metaphilosophical vacuum that people are just not entering that discussion. And you would have thought that would be really critical and central and foundational to analytic philosophy, and it's just not. Okay, I said a lot. So there's the whole problem of the sort of strategic equivocation with the terminology surrounding qualia. Then there's the problem of people treating it as impolite to go like a second layer deep. So you ask what qualia are, they tell you it's what it's like. You ask what that is, that's somehow rude. The person has discharged their responsibility to explain. Now, when you press people on that, they will sometimes say something like, sure, I understand all these. Like there's a paper by Ned Block where Ned Block is like, look, I don't even think you could give a non-circular definition, but let's give a definition anyway. It's a very strange way of framing things, where if you really thought that, then, and some of the people that I've spoken to, or I've seen conversations where this occurs, you ask them for the meaning of the initial position. So they start with A, they're asserting A. And you say, what do you mean by A? And they say B. And then you go, what do you mean by B? And they go, well, you can't really explain what A means. Well, hold up. If you can't explain what A means, and A is a primitive, incommunicable concept, why did you give me B? Now, in fairness, it could be that like maybe B is like a metaphor, or it's analogical, or maybe a different way of framing or discussing the topic will make it click with the person. They'll go, oh, okay, by A you mean B. I got it. But when that doesn't work, you fall back on the idea is fundamentally incommunicable. There seems to be something off with that. It's kind of like B is thrown out, hoping you'll go, oh, okay, even if you don't really understand. Like, well, they gave an answer, so they must mean something, when really it doesn't mean anything, and they're just hoping you'll shut up. I really get the impression that that's sometimes what people are doing. So you ask what qualia is, you're told it's what it's like, you don't know what the hell that means, but you better shut up and not ask, because that would be rude. Or if you do ask, then they might tell you, okay, it's not meaningful. So it's throwing up this kind of like bullshit decoy that's hoping that is intended to serve to get you to stop questioning. Now, I am not saying when people actually give this kind of response, when you ask what qualia is and they say what it's like, that people are intentionally doing this, like that they're intentionally trying to trick. I'm not saying that. I think people think that they're saying something substantive and meaningful. I don't think people doing philosophy are a bunch of malicious people out to like trick critics like me. What I think is happening is that people are genuinely taken in by the language games of philosophy and really think that they're doing substantive and meaningful stuff. Now, that's not like, okay, so I don't think people are trying to deliberately use rhetoric, but I think that there are patterns and ways of responding that people have been habituated into employing, where there's a lack of appreciation for the legitimacy of a critical response. That's what I'm trying to get across. So you ask what A means and they give you B, and you say, well, what does B mean? And come on, I already gave you an answer. You asked what A is, you gave me B. I told you B. Now, what are you going to do if I give you C as an answer? You're going to ask me what that means, and it's going to go to D. And if I say what D is, you're going to move it to E. And you're just going to move down the whole damn alphabet. And I'm never going to be able to get anywhere because you're just going to drill down until I can't answer you. And then you're going to go, aha. It's like a little kid going, why? Why is the sky blue? And even if you could explain something about light refraction or whatever, and they go, well, why does light refraction work that way? At a certain point, even if you knew a whole lot about optics or whatever, you're going to go, I don't know. That's just the way it is. And so I think when you press people on what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? When I'm doing that, I don't think I'm doing anything that is itself unvirtuous dialectically. Like, I'm not trying to trip someone up and get them to go to a point where they can't answer. And then I go, I win. I'm not trying to do that. I'm legitimately trying to understand what the heck they mean by qualia or phenomenal state. But in fairness, when people are pressed in that way, look, if you ask me that question, like, what do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean? At a certain point, I might get frustrated and go, look, I really don't know the answer to that. And I don't want it to be presumed that if you get me saying, I don't know, that everything else I said is a bunch of shit. Like, it doesn't mean anything, because it doesn't follow, So, if you ask a physicist, look, you're going to spend the next 10 hours explaining, we're going to start with a rock, and I want you to explain down to subatomic particles and Planck lengths and all that stuff. And they explain and explain and explain. And then you say, like, why is a Planck length exactly this length? And if they go, I don't know, you go, I gotcha. You don't know what you're talking about. No, none of that follows. And I think when I press people on what they mean by their terms and concepts, they may anticipate that I'm looking for a gotcha. I'm looking to try to undermine what they're trying to say. And I'm really not. And I think that some people might think the answers that they've given are perfectly adequate and perfectly substantive. And, the problem is with me for not understanding. But I don't know why people are so confident about that. I think it's because they've entered into certain sorts of communities where everybody says they know what they mean, and yet no one can explain what they actually mean if you try to get them to explain. So anyway, so this loop, this sort of terminological Mobius strip, what ends up happening, and this happens with moral realism and with consciousness, and that's why I talk about both. If you ask what A is, they tell you it's B. If you ask what B is and they're willing to continue the conversation, they might say C. You ask what C is, it might loop back to A. So what does it mean for something to be good? It means, well, you should do it. What does it mean to say you should do it? Well, it means it's the moral thing. What does it mean to do the moral thing? Well, it means that it's good. So you go in this endless loop and you never get anywhere. They never actually say anything meaningful. It's just A means B, B means C, C means A means B, B means C. And it's never ending. And that's really, really frustrating. Another thing that people will do is they'll simply say the concept is unanalyzable, or it's properly basic, or it's primitive, or it's incommunicable. I can't tell you any further. Now, I'm not willing to say that there could not be something like that. I'm not convinced. In fact, I suspect that there are no genuinely incommunicable concepts. I don't think that's a thing. But if there are, and also I should say, if there are, I haven't heard of any good examples. I haven't heard any compelling examples. So people will say that, and now I get really concerned when people do that, because if the concept is incommunicable, how are people communicating when two people are using terms, how do they know they're referring to the same concept? So it reminds me of the Wittgenstein's beetle box, analogy or story or whatever you want to call it. Everybody's got a beetle in the box, and, you can't really, whatever people say, you can't actually look inside someone's box to see what's in there. And it's the same thing with people appealing, two people using a term to refer to the same sort of supposed, like they're supposed to be referring to the same thing. How do we really know they're referring to the same thing? I don't know. But another concern I have, and, I've been talking to people a bit about this, and I'm still processing this and trying to come up with the best ways of addressing this idea of incommunicable concepts. And some people have said maybe this isn't the best approach, but whatever. I'll bring it up, and if you have objections or criticisms or better framings of this. One thing I do wonder is if people using terms like qualia or phenomenal state are in fact using meaningless terminology. So the terminology just goes through this sort of terminological merry-go-round that never touches down and never references the rest of the network of associations and concepts that are meaningful. If someone is using their language in that way, and they insist that they're using it in a meaningful way, but someone else was using meaningless language, like they really did, like, in fact, we could even imagine a case of a group of people as a prank deliberately constructing an artificial language where they're like, okay, hey, let's all get together. Okay, we're going to tell people that there's glorps, and glorps are florps, and florps are snorps. And then if anyone asks what a snorp is, just tell them it's a florp. So florps are glorps, glorps are snorps, and they make a loop. And so they could create an artificial language where everything is meaningless. And they could go around using the language and saying, "Yeah, this is meaningful. My friends, look, there's hundreds of us, and we know what glorps are. Okay, what's a glorp? It's a florp, of course." And then you ask another person, they say, "Yeah, it's a florp. Of course it is." I don't even know. I don't remember the order if I said florp or glorp, but you get the idea. So in that case, the language really is, by design, it has no content. It doesn't mean anything. How could you distinguish those cases if they built a sufficiently sophisticated verbal network of terminology, of terminological associations? How could you discover whether those terminological associations in that case weren't meaningful, had no content, from ones that philosophers are actually using, where I suspect that terms like qualia and phenomenal state are not meaningful? They're just like that made-up language. It's just that the people don't realize, the people using it don't realize it. How would you distinguish those from one another, like in principle? I don't know the answer. So if I propose, well, you would distinguish it in the way that a pragmatist would. You would ask, well, what do the terminology do? Can we use it for something? Can we cash it out in terms of predictions or expectations? And then I might be told, well, that's begging the question about the meaning of truth and the meaning of meaning. I'll be told, the rest of us don't have to accept your pragmatist conception. Okay, so you have some other conception. How do I know your conception? It doesn't fit into the same terminological merry-go-round where none of this terminology actually matters or does anything or whatever. And for me, what this bottoms out in is thinking, look, ultimately, when I'm trying to think through these philosophical issues, is I want to get something done. There's this great quote at the beginning of Horwig's book on Wittgenstein's Metaphilosophy. It's a quote from Wittgenstein that says something like this. It's going to be a paraphrase. I can't remember it offhand. But it's a quote from Wittgenstein that says something like, "My father was a businessman. I want philosophy to be businesslike. I want it to get something done." And that's how I view philosophy. And so when people are going through all this terminology, ultimately for me, what I care about, I don't need set aside all your concerns about correspondence theory, truth, what you think is true or false. I just want to ask, what can I do with these terms and concepts? Can they help me get something done? Can they help me get something done that I care about? And if the answer is no, I have very little use for them. Now, it might sound to you it might sound really questionable, because there's probably some obscure ideas in like chemistry that I couldn't find any use for. But I think chemistry is useful. And I think people doing chemistry and studying chemistry can do useful things with it. So there doesn't have to be this immediate, accessible, obvious utility to the concepts or terms in question for me to consider them meaningful in the relevant sort of sense, for them to have utility or value in some sort of practical sense. They just have to figure into the broader network of terms and concepts and ideas that I do think have practical value in some way, where they're doing some kind of work. And so what I want to know about a lot of these philosophical concepts is, what work can they do? What can they get done? And a lot of times I think the answer appears to be that they can't do anything. And then the people defending them are going to say, but they're still true. Okay. So if someone wants to work on all their rarefied truths existing in some ethereal realm that don't do anything, ultimately, even if there are those things, I guess I just don't care about them. Like, I care about stuff that actually has some practical impact on the world. Okay, I said a lot, so let me continue going through the chat. All right, let's see. This is going way back to an hour ago. In fact, an hour and 1 minute. People try to call subjectivism a form of minimal moral realism, which I find disconcerting. I don't find it disconcerting. I understand why you might, although you didn't say. I can understand reasons why someone might find it disconcerting. So you'll sometimes see people describe moral realism as the view that there are moral facts, and that would be consistent with certain types of relativism or subjectivism, according to which there are moral facts. It's just they're true or false in a relative sense. I don't know why I said some types, pretty much any type. I don't know of a subjectivism that doesn't hold that there's moral facts. They are cognitivist positions. They do hold that there are moral facts. I guess you could have one that says, you could have that would be interesting, a subjectivist error theory, where your semantic theory is that everybody is using moral language to describe their preferences, but nobody has preferences. Like maybe you're an eliminativist about mental states or something. So I've never heard of this, but this would be, wow, okay. This is a weird idea. Okay, so imagine your semantic thesis is that when people make moral claims, they are speaker relativists. They're reporting what their standards are. So a claim like murder is wrong would mean something like murder is inconsistent with my moral standards. And then you could say, well, obviously, if it is inconsistent with their moral standards, then that statement would be true. And if it's not, like they're lying or they're confused or something, then it would be false. So moral statements are truth apt, and some of them are true, at least some of the time. But what if people were committed to a certain type of folk psychology where when they report what their moral standards are, they're expressing like moral beliefs, but there are no such thing as beliefs. And so now all those moral statements are actually false because their folk psychology implicit in them is wrong. So then you would get a subjectivist error theory. Never heard of such a thing, but it's possible. And on that view, you could have a person that's a subjectivist that doesn't actually think there are any moral facts. They think that they're like could be in principle, but there aren't in practice or something like that. Or maybe they don't think there could be in principle. It would depend which modality you're going with, like metaphysical or logical possibility. And maybe it could vary by the account. I don't know. I mean, I'm making this up as I go. But I've never heard of that type of error theory. So someone should go write a paper. I bet you there's a paper on it already. And if there isn't, someone go write one, because I'm probably not going to do it. Oh, right. Is conceptual analysis the most problematic method in your view? I don't know. I don't know what I would say the most problematic method is. So I would like to see like a list of the supposed methods of philosophy. I think, no, I wouldn't say that. I mean, it's really going to depend on how you flesh out conceptual analysis. So for me, one of the primary concerns is like one thing I don't like is when people will analyze toy sentences. So they'll try to understand concepts by analyzing toy sentences, like decontextualized sentences that are made up. Like, if you wanted to know what people mean when they say murder is wrong, you analyze murder is wrong as like a free-floating sentence that no one is actually asserting in any actual context. And then you reason about it, and the answers are supposed to be like a priori. I don't think that makes any sense at all. I don't think that there are a priori facts about what a decontextualized sentence means, because I don't think decontextualized sentences mean anything. The only thing that is actually going on with sentences like murder is wrong, I take actual instances of someone asserting murder is wrong to be behaviors there, and the sentence itself doesn't mean anything intrinsically. The sentence is used to express the meaning of whoever is expressing the claim. And there's a psychological fact about the communicative intent of that speaker. And so there's no way to analyze the meaning, not even in principle, I think, of murder is wrong, quote unquote, murder is wrong, because I don't think if no one's saying it, that it doesn't have any meaning. So when philosophers are trying to analyze concepts, I often what they seem to be doing is engaged in some sort of a prioristic enterprise that I think could not succeed in principle, because I don't think that words have intrinsic meaning. Now, that might be a really tendentious and like a really partisan way of framing the dispute. If they are making empirical claims about what people intend to communicate, then they're just using a terrible method for different reasons. So I think it's kind of lose-lose. So I'm not even sure what they take themselves to be doing. But there's also, take people trying to figure out what knowledge is. It looks like people are trying to generate a kind of super dictionary of like precisely the application conditions for when non-philosophers would deploy the concept of knowledge and say you do know in these cases and you don't know in those cases. And in that case, it looks like they're really trying to understand how people are using a word. And then you might be told, and this, this account, this epistemological account of the nature of knowledge, it's normative. What the hell? What does that mean? So we find out how people use a word. So should we use the word that way? Like what? I don't even know what's supposed to be going on here. Are we trying to figure out how people use a word, or are we trying to figure out like the essence of the concept of knowledge? I don't know exactly what's going on. Other things, I wouldn't take that much issue with like reflective equilibrium. If you have inconsistent views, I'm kind of in favor of trying to render your views more consistent. But for me, that's for entirely pragmatic reasons, because I think if you have inconsistent beliefs, it might be harder to achieve your goals and get the kinds of things you want done. It's not because I think that there's like as we move towards a state of reflective equilibrium, we're all sort of converging on like the singular set of correct views that we're all trying to like, in resolving my inconsistencies and you resolving your inconsistencies, the expectation is that we'll converge together. Or we could even converge on well, maybe there'll be no convergence, but there'll be just sort of an individual distillation and rendering consistent our personal set of views. I could see practical value in that, so I have less of a concern with that. I think there's probably going to be deep but difficult problems with people appealing to intuitions. I think that's murky territory because there's both trivial respects in which appealing to intuitions is probably okay up to a point, and then there's going to be greater difficulties of people doing that. Other methodological concerns I have largely center on non-empirical kinds of considerations and presumptions in favor of certain views as being true based on the notion that a particular thing is intuitive or is common sense without it being clear what that means or without it being clear whether that's true, if it's sufficiently meaningful that we could see whether it's true or false. So for instance, if someone says, look, moral realism is the common sense view, all or most people find moral realism intuitive, and this puts the burden of proof. It's a presumption in favor of realism. Just like there's a presumption trees exist, there's a presumption that moral facts exist, and it's the onus is on the skeptic to show otherwise and present defeaters. I don't accept that because I just think it's false that it's the common sense view. Okay, this might be kind of a tough question for me to answer. Can you give me some recommendations on how I could learn to review and come up with my own opinions and arguments on philosophical topics? For example, moral realism versus anti-realism. So there are other people that I think are probably better to ask for like book recommendations and article recommendations, that sort of thing. You could check out Majesty of Reason's channel. I know that Joe often offers advice on like particular books and gets a lot more excited. I'm so pessimistic and critical of so much philosophy, it's hard for me to recommend things. And I'm not joking about that. It actually is hard for me. So check out that channel. It also is going to depend what medium you prefer to consume content in. So you have a few options. Here, I'll just give some general. Okay, so you have the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a kind of go-to resource where that often has really high quality articles on there. They are written for. I mean, they're not. Sometimes they're really technical. They vary because each one has a different author, but they're not like written for a non-specialist. They're written in a way where they might be like moderately inaccessible or difficult to work through, but often I don't find too much difficulty. It really is going to vary based on the article. But Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a good resource, so you can look up the sort of entries on moral realism, anti-realism. There's probably entries on other topics that are related to what I do. I don't know how much there is on metaphilosophy. That's one resource. I already mentioned Majesty of Reason, but a lot of that is going to be philosophy of religion and stuff. But I don't know, it's still a good channel. Kane B is excellent for meta ethics. So Kane B has a whole series that covers a lot of this stuff. One thing, so Kane B doesn't have a lot of there's not a lot of superfluous stuff. So Kane on that channel will just get straight into the content, and Kane is an anti-realist, and so there might be a degree you'll get more of an anti-realist perspective towards the end of some of those videos, but the attempt at accounting for the positions and describing them tends to be it's neutral. It's not like here's what realists say, look how dumb this is. It's not like that. It's here's what Enoch says about this. Here's what Humer says about this, and it's right from the source material. So that's a great channel to check out. There should be a playlist for meta ethics right in the channel. I'm tempted to go grab it, but just look up Kane B. In fact, I'll type it in the Kane B. You'll find Kane B with that. So that's a good online resource here on YouTube. Kane's been doing this for years, and there's a bunch. I would bet there's like 40 videos. Maybe there's less. Maybe there's like 20 on meta ethics. Maybe just 20. I don't know. It's a lot of videos. It's a lot of content. It's hours of content. There are introductory books. I always forget the name of the one that I recommend. Give me 1 second. I'll find that one. Yeah, I was going to say it's an introduction to metaethics, but it's not. It's called Contemporary Metaethics and Introduction. So this is a pretty good introduction to contemporary metaethics. So you could grab that book, and that's worth having a look at. Oh, I guess I can recommend stuff. Okay. Uh, so learn to review and come up with my own opinions and arguments on philosophical topics, for example. It looks like it's a more general, and realism, anti-realism was just an example of the kind of things that you were looking at. Okay, I'll make a more general point about this. There's certainly a lot of introductory material you could read. There's more specialized material you could read. There are books and there are journal articles and all sorts of stuff. What I have found in that is that in my experience, a lot of my particular, I mean, there's different things you get out of reading. Reading might introduce you to certain terms and concepts that might get technical. It might get into the details of certain views that are more obscure that you might not be aware of, or might give you the kind of the meat of particular sorts of ideas. But there is no substitute for having conversations about philosophical content. And I think that that's something that's severely lacking in the way that people approach philosophy in like the contemporary academic philosophy, is that it's I think far too focused on essays and journal articles and papers and books to some extent. And it's not nearly focused enough on conversations and just talking things through. So for me, I would say I've gotten a lot more, and I really mean this, a lot more simply out of talking to people than I have from any amount of reading. And that might sound outrageous. I do think that they serve different roles and that they're synergistic. So again, there's not a substitute for reading either, or consuming some kind of content, YouTube videos, podcasts, audiobooks, written, papers, books, whatever. That's all critical and important. But there's a different skill set and a different, and part of the way that you sharpen the way that you think is to talk things through with people. And you could both talk with people that share similar views and sort of work collaboratively on clarifying your own views or constructing or like improving on your views, and talking to people that have contrary philosophical views and that are willing and able to challenge you in a constructive way. So I find those conversations, you got to have conversations with people. I think that's really an incredibly valuable way to advance your ability to develop opinions. The other thing I would say is you should certainly be willing, and I don't necessarily practice what I'm preaching here, to change your mind on philosophical views. You shouldn't get so attached to a view that you should be unwilling to abandon it. I think a lot of times people might feel that it would be embarrassing or humiliating, or people would think less of them if they change their mind on views. And this is very rarely the case. Especially, it's one thing if you just change your mind and then you're like, I'm a realist, and I'm an anti-realist for like no particular reason. I don't care if whatever, do that if you want, or maybe that's how you think about things. There's nothing wrong with feeling like you're on the fence and vacillating between one or another view. But if someone presents really good arguments, you consider them and you're like, yeah, I think that's convincing. I'll change my mind on that. No one's going to think less of you. So certainly be open to changing your mind and going wherever your views go on a particular philosophical issue, even if, you could be, I'm not going to fault you if you end up being a realist or a panpsychist or some view I disagree with myself. And also who cares what you think about these things. But what I would say is get into conversations, talk to people that agree with you, talk to people that disagree with you, get them to challenge you. And that sort of trial by direct engagement is incredibly valuable. All right, let's see what else we got. Have I read anything by Graziano on consciousness? Not really, no. I'm vaguely aware that it's in the vicinity of some of my interests, but no, I haven't read it. Oh, right. Okay, this is interesting. I made my own argument for anti-realism. If aesthetics are subjective, then morality is subjective. Both are action guiding thoughts. Most of the realists accept aesthetic realism, which is funny. So it's interesting because this looks like a reverse companions and guilt argument. You might want to call it a companions and innocence argument. I don't know, because that thought has already occurred. That's how I was able to spit it out so quickly. I've thought of similar arguments like this myself. I haven't written a paper on it, and I haven't seen a paper on it. someone should write a paper on it. But the closest I've seen to something like this is a paper by Don Loeb on gastronomic realism. I really love this paper. I have seen some people say pretty harsh things about it, but I really love it. Let me look up the paper and link it. Yeah, I see that you say this, reverse of Cuneo. Here it is. So it's this paper, Gastronomic Realism, a Cautionary Tale. And in this paper, what Loeb basically points out is that many of the sorts of reasons we have for thinking that moral realism is true could also be employed to argue that gastronomic realism is true, that there's facts about what foods are gastronomically good or bad, or that you gastronomically should or shouldn't eat. So by gastronomically good or bad or should or shouldn't, Loeb means this independent of like their nutritional qualities of the food, or like how much the food costs, or any other sorts of considerations. Just it's pure, not even how good or bad it tastes to you, like personally, but it's like intrinsic quality as being gastronomically good or bad. So you might say caviar is gastronomically better than like Cheez-Its or something, and therefore you should eat caviar and not Cheez-Its because it's gastronomically better, something like that. And the idea there is Loeb is careful not to say, yeah, I'm explicitly presenting this as a reductio, but that could be an implication someone sees from it, is that if accepting moral realism would require me to accept gastronomic realism, and I don't want to do that, then maybe I shouldn't accept moral realism. So there's a similar idea potentially at play in that paper. Someone could formalize this more into an argument. I think rather than choosing aesthetics, because you point out here, you say most of the realists accept aesthetic realism, which is funny. I don't know if it's most, and I'm not. So in the Phil Papers 2020 survey, it's something like 40% of the respondents said that they favored aesthetic objectivism, but it wasn't aesthetic realism. So I'm not entirely sure what exactly they take their position to mean when people were choosing aesthetic objectivism. I think it was the most common response, but because there's you could choose other and a variety of like sub responses, it wasn't a majority of the respondents. So it wasn't more than 50%, but it might've been like the modal response, like the most common response. But again, it was like 40% favored aesthetic objectivism, whatever the heck that's supposed to mean. Now, it could be that a lot of realists would just say, yeah, that's not a big problem for me. I'm perfectly happy to accept aesthetic realism. In fact, I already did. Or they might go, oh, I would have to accept that. Okay, not a big problem for me. The same thing if you tried to tie it to, epistemic facts like, Cuneo does in the normative web. Like they might just say, okay, sure, right? So if you wanted to have this kind of companions and innocence argument, then you might want to appeal to a normative domain that it would be difficult to deny, but that would also be kind of silly to. You want to have one that it would be. It wouldn't be that people are inclined immediately to go, sure, that's fine. They would have to go, oh, I don't want to accept that, but it would have to be plausible that they would have to accept it too. And I don't know what that would look like. I don't know what domain. Maybe gastronomic realism, does the job. But yeah, you could kind of make this appeal that if you have to accept moral realism, you have to accept these other types of realism you don't want to accept. So, hey, maybe you should reconsider moral realism. That's totally a style of argument that someone could use. Okay, so we're at the hour and a half mark. There was someone that wanted to join me earlier. So I am going to, if they're in the chat, let me know. Are you here? Okay. If you are, definitely let me know. Otherwise, I guess I will close it out here today. Okay. I checked with them and they're not going to be able to make it. All right. So I'm going to close it out there. Thanks everybody for being here. I didn't quite hit the hour and a half mark. But yeah, thanks everybody for being here. And I hope y'all had a good time, and I will see y'all later.